In 1644, a handful of horsemen from the frozen wastelands beyond the Great Wall achieved what seemed impossible. They conquered one of the most powerful empires on earth. The Ming Dynasty, rulers of China for nearly 3 centuries, commanding armies numbering in the hundreds of thousands and governing over 100 million souls, fell not to European cannons or internal revolution, but to warriors the Chinese had dismissed as barbarians for generations. These were the Manchus, a people who had spent decades transforming from scattered tribes living in felt tents and hunting in primeval forests into a military machine capable of toppling an empire that had stood since before Columbus reached the Americas. But how did a population smaller than a single Chinese province manage to seize control of the Middle Kingdom, with its vast cities, sophisticated bureaucracy, and seemingly impregnable Great Wall? The answer lies in a tale of strategic brilliance, cultural adaptation, and the fatal weaknesses that brought down one of history's greatest civilizations. What you're about to discover will challenge everything you thought you knew about conquest and empire, revealing how the most unlikely victors in world history achieved their triumph, not through brute force, but through a masterful combination of military innovation, political cunning, and cultural transformation that would reshape the fate of nearly a quarter of humanity. To understand this extraordinary transformation, we must journey back to the early 1600s, when the land beyond China's northeastern frontier was a harsh realm of endless forests, frozen rivers, and scattered settlements where the Jurchen tribes, the ancestors of the Manchus, struggled to survive. These were not the unified force that would later shake the world, but rather dozens of scattered clans locked in perpetual warfare, their lives defined by the brutal cycle of hunting, fishing, raiding, and revenge that had governed their ancestors for centuries. The Chinese Ming emperors, secure behind their Great Wall and confident in their cultural superiority, viewed these northern peoples as useful barbarians, dangerous enough to respect, but divided enough to control through the ancient strategy of playing one tribe against another. Ming generals would arm one Jurchen clan to attack another, ensuring that no single leader could unite these fractious peoples into a threat to the empire. Yet, among these fractured tribes, scattered across a landscape that seemed designed to prevent unity, something remarkable was stirring in the late 16th century. A leader was emerging who possessed not just the warrior's courage that his people respected, but the strategic vision to see beyond the immediate needs of survival to a future his contemporaries could barely imagine. His name was Nurhaci, and his rise would set in motion events that would echo through centuries, transforming not just his own people, but the entire balance of power in East Asia. But first, he had to survive the treacherous world of Jurchen politics, where a single misstep, a moment of weakness, or a misplaced trust could mean not just personal death, but the extinction of his entire bloodline. Nurhaci's early life read like a blueprint for creating a revolutionary leader, shaped by tragedy, hardship, and the harsh lessons that only personal loss can teach. Born around 1559 into the Aisin Gyoro clan, one of many minor Jurchen tribes scattered across the Changbai Mountains, he seemed destined for the same cycle of tribal warfare and subsistence living that had defined his people for generations. But fate had different plans when, in 1583, rival Jurchens, backed by Chinese forces, killed his father Taxi and grandfather Jiucheng in a raid that was meant to eliminate potential threats to Ming control. The 24-year-old Nurhaci found himself not only orphaned, but also facing the very real possibility that his family line would be wiped out entirely. Rather than seek immediate revenge in the hot-blooded manner expected of a Jurchen warrior, the young leader demonstrated the strategic patience and cold calculation that would define his entire reign. He spent years carefully building alliances through marriage, adoption, and mutual benefit, turning former enemies into allies and gradually accumulating the power base he would need for the greater struggle ahead. More importantly, he began studying his enemies with an intensity that bordered on obsession, learning Chinese language and literature, absorbing their military tactics, and most crucially, beginning to understand the administrative systems and political structures that held their vast empire together. He realized that defeating the Chinese would require more than superior courage or tactical skill. It meant becoming better at their own game than the Chinese themselves were. By 1616, after 3 decades of careful preparation, Nurhaci had achieved what generations of Jurchen leaders had failed to accomplish. He unified the fractured tribes under a single banner and boldly declared himself Khan of the later Jin, directly challenging Ming authority and announcing to the world that a new power had emerged in the north. But unification was only the beginning of his master plan, and what came next would revolutionize not just how wars were fought, but how entire societies could be transformed for conquest. Nurhaci's greatest innovation wasn't just political or military, it was a complete reimagining of how society itself could be organized for maximum efficiency and loyalty, creating something entirely new in the process. He developed the 8 banners system, organizing his entire people into military units distinguished by colored flags, yellow, white, red, and blue, each with plain and bordered variants that created 8 distinct organizational structures. This wasn't merely an army in the traditional sense. It was a complete reorganization of Jurchen society where every man, woman, and child belonged to a specific banner, creating unprecedented levels of loyalty, efficiency, and social mobility based on merit rather than birth. Each banner contained several thousand fighting men at full strength, along with their families, servants, and support personnel, making each banner a self-contained military and administrative unit capable of independent operation across vast distances. The system brilliantly broke down old tribal loyalties that had kept the Jurchens divided for centuries, replacing them with devotion to the banner and, ultimately, to Nurhaci himself as the supreme Khan who stood above all tribal divisions. More revolutionary still, Nurhaci began incorporating Chinese and Mongol defectors into his ranks, creating the first truly multi-ethnic force in the region and demonstrating that loyalty to the new order mattered more than blood or tribal origin. Chinese scholars who joined the Manchu cause found themselves elevated to positions of real authority, while Mongol cavalrymen brought their superior horsemanship and knowledge of steppe warfare tactics. This integration wasn't just pragmatic, it was visionary, creating a society where the best ideas from multiple cultures could be combined and refined. The banner system also solved one of the fundamental problems that had plagued nomadic confederations throughout history: how to maintain unity and discipline across vast territories without the infrastructure of settled civilization. Each banner could operate independently for months, but all remained connected through a complex system of communication, shared rituals, and rotating assignments that prevented any single banner from developing separatist tendencies. When Ming forces finally recognized the threat that Nurhaci represented and began mobilizing their vast resources against him, they discovered they were facing something entirely unprecedented. An enemy that learned from every encounter, incorporated the best practices of every opponent, and grew stronger rather than weaker with each victory. The question that haunted Chinese strategists was whether the might of Imperial China, built on centuries of military tradition and supported by vast wealth, could adapt quickly enough to counter this emerging threat that seemed to evolve with each passing season. While Nurhaci was revolutionizing warfare and social organization in the northeast, the Ming Dynasty was slowly strangling itself with the very traditions and institutions that had once made it one of the most powerful empires of its time. Emperor Wanli, who ruled from 1572 to 1620 during the crucial decades when the Manchu threat was emerging, had retreated into the Forbidden City and refused to hold court or meet with his ministers for nearly 3 decades, leaving the empire effectively rudderless at its most critical moment in history. This wasn't merely personal eccentricity. It represented a fundamental breakdown in the Confucian system of governance that depended on the emperor's active participation in daily administration and decision-making. The imperial bureaucracy, once renowned as the most sophisticated governmental system in the world, had become a labyrinthine maze of corruption, where positions were bought and sold like commodities, where competent officials were blocked by political enemies, and where critical information often never reached those who needed to act on it. Military commands were distributed based on political connections rather than battlefield competence, with generals more concerned about court intrigue than enemy movements. Most dangerously for the empire's survival, the Ming military establishment had grown complacent after centuries of dominance, still relying on tactics, weapons, and organizational structures that had worked against previous enemies but were proving woefully inadequate against Nurhaci's adaptive and innovative forces. The empire's vast wealth, built on centuries of agricultural surplus, tribute from vassal states, and extensive trade network, was being systematically drained by costly military campaigns against Japanese invasions in Korea, rebellions across multiple provinces, and the constant expense of maintaining the world's largest standing army and bureaucracy. Corruption had become so endemic that tax revenues often disappeared into private pockets before reaching the imperial treasury, while military supplies were routinely sold on the black market by the very officials responsible for distributing them to troops. When Ming generals finally engaged Nurhaci's forces directly at the Battle of Sahu in 1619, they learned a harsh and costly lesson about the dangers of underestimating an enemy they had dismissed as barbarian rabble. 4 separate Ming armies, totaling over 100,000 well-equipped professional soldiers supported by artillery and cavalry, advanced against what Chinese intelligence reports described as a ragtag collection of tribal warriors with primitive weapons and no understanding of civilized warfare. Instead, they encountered Nurhaci's concentrated forces using superior tactics, better intelligence, and devastating mobility to defeat each Ming army in detail before they could support each other. The defeat was so catastrophic that it shattered Ming confidence on their northeastern frontier forever. But more importantly, it revealed to perceptive observers that the empire's military superiority was no longer guaranteed. Chinese soldiers who survived Sahu returned with terrifying reports of enemy discipline, coordination, and tactical sophistication that seemed impossible for barbarians to achieve. But Sahu was just the beginning of the Ming's troubles, and the lessons learned there would soon be applied on an even larger scale. When Nurhaci died in 1626, struck down at the height of his power by illness contracted during a grueling campaign, many observers, both Chinese and foreign, expected his nascent empire to fragment and collapse, as so many barbarian confederations had throughout history. The pattern seemed inevitable. Charismatic leader unites divided tribes, achieves initial victories against settled civilizations, dies, and his empire immediately splits apart as sons and generals fight over the succession while external enemies exploit the chaos. Instead, Nurhaci's 8th son Hong Taiji ascended to power through a carefully managed succession process and proved even more dangerous to Chinese interests than his father, not because he was a superior warrior, though his military skills were considerable, but because he was a far more sophisticated statesman with an even clearer vision of what victory would ultimately require. Hong Taiji understood with startling clarity that military conquest alone would never be sufficient to rule China. His people would need to transform themselves from conquerors into legitimate rulers, and that transformation would require becoming Chinese in every way except blood and ultimate loyalty. He embarked on a systematic campaign to adopt Chinese governmental structures, recruit Chinese scholars and administrators into positions of real authority, and most significantly, to reshape Manchu identity itself to fit their new role as empire builders rather than tribal raiders. In 1635, Hong Taiji made a decision that seemed minor but carried profound implications. He renamed his people from Jurchen to Manchu, deliberately distancing them from their tribal past and creating a new identity that could incorporate anyone willing to serve the new order loyally. This wasn't just a cosmetic change, it represented a fundamental shift in how the Manchus understood themselves and their relationship to the civilization they intended to rule. Hong Taiji went even further in 1636, proclaiming the Ming Dynasty 8 full years before his forces would set foot in Beijing, demonstrating his absolute confidence in ultimate victory, while also establishing the political and administrative framework that would govern China for the next 3 centuries. He created a sophisticated government that blended Manchu military efficiency with Chinese administrative sophistication, establishing parallel structures where Manchu and Chinese officials worked side by side in every department, ensuring both competence and political reliability. The new system incorporated the best features of traditional Chinese governance, while adding Manchu innovations in military organization, personnel management, and territorial administration that would prove remarkably durable and effective. Hong Taiji also began the delicate process of cultural integration, patronizing Chinese literature and scholarship while requiring Chinese officials to adopt certain Manchu customs, creating a hybrid culture that honored both traditions while serving the needs of the emerging empire. The Manchus were no longer barbarians trying to destroy Chinese civilization. They were positioning themselves as its rightful inheritors, destined to restore order and prosperity to a realm that had fallen into chaos under incompetent native rule. This transformation in identity and purpose would prove absolutely crucial when they faced their greatest test and opportunity as the Ming Dynasty began its final, catastrophic collapse. By the 1640s, the Ming Dynasty was facing a convergence of disasters that would have challenged even the most competent government, but proved absolutely fatal to an empire already weakened by decades of misrule and institutional decay. A series of natural disasters, including severe droughts, floods, and locust swarms, had devastated agricultural production across northern China, creating widespread famine and displacing millions of peasants who had no choice but to turn to banditry or rebellion for survival. The most dangerous of these rebel movements was led by Li Zusheng, a former postal worker who had been dismissed from government service and turned to banditry before discovering a genius for military organization and popular mobilization. Li's forces, composed primarily of desperate peasants and deserting government soldiers, had grown from a few hundred followers into an army of over 300,000 that controlled vast territories across northern China and posed an existential threat to Ming rule. What made Li particularly dangerous wasn't just his military success, but his ability to present himself as a legitimate alternative to Ming rule, promising to eliminate corruption, reduce taxes, and restore prosperity to the common people who had suffered under decades of imperial misgovernment. Meanwhile, other rebel armies, led by figures like Zhang Shanzhong, were wreaking havoc across central and western China, stretching imperial resources to the breaking point and making coordinated resistance increasingly impossible. The imperial court, paralyzed by factional infighting and financial crisis, proved incapable of mounting an effective response to multiple simultaneous threats, with different government factions pursuing contradictory policies that often ended up helping the rebels more than hindering them. Imperial armies sent to suppress one rebellion would be recalled to deal with another crisis, allowing defeated rebel forces to regroup and return stronger than before. The empire's financial situation had become so desperate that soldiers often went months without pay, leading to widespread desertion and mutiny that further weakened the government's ability to maintain order. In this chaos, the Manchus under Hong Taiji's leadership saw not just opportunity but vindication of their strategy. They had spent decades preparing for exactly this moment, when Chinese incompetence would create the opening for a more capable power to step in and restore stability. The stage was being set for one of history's most remarkable political reversals, where the supposed barbarians would present themselves as the only force capable of saving Chinese civilization from itself. The final conquest of China came not through a massive Manchu invasion smashing through the Great Wall, but through an invitation extended by the very Chinese officials sworn to defend the empire against foreign enemies. By early 1644, Li Zucheng's rebel army had captured most of northern China and was advancing on Beijing itself, while the Ming court had descended into complete chaos, with different factions blaming each other for the empire's collapse rather than taking effective action to prevent it. When Li's forces finally breached Beijing's defenses in April 1644, the last Ming emperor, Chongzhen, faced the ultimate humiliation of being captured by rebels he considered beneath contempt. Rather than endure such disgrace, he hanged himself from a tree in the Forbidden City, but not before writing a final decree, blaming his ministers and generals for the dynasty's fall while taking no responsibility for his own failures of leadership. The emperor's suicide left a power vacuum that Li Zucheng quickly moved to fill, declaring himself emperor of a new dynasty and beginning the process of consolidating control over the imperial capital. But Li's triumph was premature, because his victory had created an unexpected and ultimately fatal complication. Wu Sangui, the Ming general defending the crucial Shanhai Pass that controlled the only major route between Manchuria and China proper, suddenly found himself in an impossible position that would determine the fate of empires. Li Zucheng's forces had captured Wu's family in Beijing and were demanding his immediate surrender, while also making it clear that his previous service to the Ming would not be forgotten or forgiven under the new regime. At the same time, the Manchus under Dogon, Hong Taiji's brother, who had become regent for the child emperor Shunji after Hong Taiji's death in 1643, were positioned just beyond the Great Wall, with a powerful army ready to take advantage of Chinese weakness. Wu Sangui faced a choice that would reshape world history. Submit to the peasant rebel Li Zucheng, who had murdered his emperor and threatened his family, or ally with the foreign Manchus, who had been his sworn enemies for decades, but who might offer better terms and more reliable protection. In a decision that demonstrated both pragmatic calculation and desperate hope, Wu chose the Manchus, sending envoys to Dogon with an offer that stunned even the confident Manchu leadership. He would open the gates of China to foreign conquest in exchange for Manchu help in destroying Li Zucheng and restoring legitimate order. What followed wasn't the sack of Beijing that might have been expected when barbarian armies captured one of the world's greatest cities, but something far more remarkable and historically significant. The Manchus entered the capital not as destructive conquerors, but as disciplined liberators, maintaining strict military discipline, protecting civilians and property, and immediately beginning the process of establishing a new government that would blend the best features of Chinese and Manchu administration. Within months, they had eliminated Li Zucheng's rebel army, restored order to the capital, and positioned themselves not as foreign occupiers, but as the legitimate rulers of China who had saved the empire from chaos and destruction. The barbarians had become emperors not through the destruction of Chinese civilization, but through superior political maneuvering and administrative competence demonstrated at the moment of ultimate crisis. The Manchu transformation of China proved to be one of history's most successful and enduring examples of minority rule over a vast majority population, achieved through a delicate balance of adaptation, innovation, and respect for existing institutions that created something entirely new while honoring the best of what came before. Rather than imposing their tribal culture on their Chinese subjects or attempting to rule through pure military force, the Manchus became masters of cultural synthesis, adopting Chinese governmental structures and Confucian political philosophy while maintaining their martial traditions, distinct identity, and ultimate political control. This wasn't mere pragmatism. It was a sophisticated understanding that successful rule required earning genuine legitimacy rather than relying solely on fear or coercion. The early Qing emperors implemented a dual system where major government positions were filled by both Manchu and Chinese officials working in partnership, ensuring administrative competence while preventing any single ethnic group from dominating the imperial bureaucracy. They required Chinese men to adopt the Manchu queue hairstyle and certain elements of Manchu dress as symbols of submission to the new order, but they also elevated Chinese scholars to the highest positions in government and became generous patrons of traditional Chinese arts, literature, and scholarship. The Manchus ended up being more dedicated to Confucian ideals of virtuous governance than many native Chinese dynasties, establishing schools, promoting agricultural development, and maintaining the examination system that allowed talented individuals from any background to rise to positions of authority based on merit rather than birth. They also demonstrated remarkable religious tolerance, supporting Buddhist and Taoist institutions while maintaining their own shamanistic traditions, and later showing similar respect for Christianity and Islam as their empire expanded to include peoples of many different faiths. The early Qing emperors, Kangxi, Yongzheng, and Qianlong, would preside over what many historians consider one of China's greatest golden ages, a period of unprecedented expansion, prosperity, and cultural achievement that lasted for more than a century and established China as the dominant power in East Asia. Under their rule, the empire expanded to its greatest territorial extent in history, incorporating Tibet, Xinjiang, Mongolia, and Taiwan, while maintaining tributary relationships with Korea, Vietnam, and other neighboring states. The population doubled from roughly 100 million to over 200 million during the first century of Qing rule, while agricultural productivity increased dramatically through the introduction of new crops from the Americas and improved farming techniques that maximized yield from existing land. But perhaps most remarkably, the Manchus achieved what the Romans, the Arabs, and later the British could only dream of. They didn't just conquer a great civilization, they became its most successful exemplars, creating a golden age that would be remembered and romanticized for centuries after their dynasty fell. The reign of the Kangxi Emperor from 1661 to 1722 represented the fullest flowering of Manchu political genius and demonstrated how completely the former barbarians had mastered the art of Chinese governance. Kangxi, who ruled for 61 years and became one of the longest reigning monarchs in world history, embodied the Confucian ideal of the sage king while maintaining the martial vigor that had brought his people to power. He was equally comfortable leading armies in person against rebels and foreign enemies as he was debating classical literature with the greatest scholars of his age, demonstrating a versatility that few rulers in any culture have matched. His military achievements were staggering. He successfully suppressed the rebellion of the three feudatories, a massive uprising that threatened to tear the new dynasty apart. He conquered Taiwan and integrated it into the empire for the first time. He defeated Russian expansion into Manchuria and established the Treaty of Nurhaci, the first major diplomatic agreement between China and a European power. And he personally led campaigns that brought Tibet under Chinese suzerainty while respecting its religious autonomy. But Kangxi's cultural and administrative achievements were equally impressive, as he became a patron of learning whose court attracted scholars from across the empire and whose personal library contained over 40,000 volumes in Chinese, Manchu, Mongol, and other languages. He commissioned massive scholarly projects, including the Kangxi Dictionary, which standardized Chinese written language for centuries, and the complete library of the Four Treasuries, an encyclopedic collection of Chinese learning that preserved thousands of works that might otherwise have been lost. Perhaps most importantly, Kangxi demonstrated that the Manchus had truly earned the mandate of heaven through effective governance and moral leadership, as his reign brought unprecedented prosperity, territorial expansion, and cultural flourishing that impressed visitors from around the world. European missionaries and diplomats who reached his court were amazed by the sophistication of Chinese administration under Manchu rule, the extent of the empire's wealth and power, and the emperor's personal knowledge and wisdom. Kangxi's success wasn't just personal, it validated the entire Manchu project of cultural synthesis and demonstrated that foreign rulers could become more Chinese than the Chinese themselves, while still maintaining their own identity and traditions. His reign established the template for successful minority rule that would influence political thinking across Asia and beyond, showing that conquest could lead to cultural elevation rather than destruction when approached with the right combination of respect, adaptation, and vision. Under Manchu rule, China experienced an economic and cultural renaissance that transformed not only the empire itself, but its relationship with the wider world, creating prosperity and artistic achievement on a scale that wouldn't be matched again until the modern era. The Qing emperor's commitment to agricultural development and population growth created a virtuous cycle where increased food production supported larger populations, which in turn provided more labor for both farming and manufacturing, generating the surplus wealth that funded territorial expansion, cultural projects, and administrative innovation. New crops introduced from the Americas, including corn, sweet potatoes, and peanuts, allowed Chinese farmers to cultivate previously marginal lands and support population growth in regions that had never been densely settled, while improved irrigation systems and farming techniques maximized productivity from existing agricultural areas. The empire's manufacturing capabilities expanded dramatically, with Chinese artisans producing silk, porcelain, tea, and other luxury goods that were eagerly sought by merchants from across the known world, creating trade networks that stretched from Southeast Asia to Europe and generated enormous wealth for the imperial treasury. The Manchus proved to be shrewd economic managers, maintaining the traditional Chinese system of state monopolies on salt and iron, while encouraging private enterprise in other sectors and investing heavily in infrastructure projects that improved communication and transportation across their vast territories. They built and maintained thousands of miles of roads, canals, and postal routes that connected the most remote provinces to the imperial capital, while also establishing a sophisticated system of granaries and disaster relief that helped prevent famines and maintain social stability even during periods of natural disaster. Cultural achievements were equally impressive, as Qing patronage supported a flowering of literature, art, philosophy, and scholarship that produced works still considered masterpieces today. The great novels of Chinese literature, including Dream of the Red Chamber, often considered the greatest work of Chinese fiction, were written during the Qing period, while painters, poets, and philosophers reached new heights of artistic and intellectual achievement under imperial sponsorship. The Manchus also supported the preservation and systematization of Chinese learning through massive scholarly projects that collected, edited, and published the classical works of Chinese civilization, ensuring their survival for future generations while also making them more widely available to scholars and students. Perhaps most remarkably, this cultural renaissance occurred while the empire was simultaneously expanding its borders, integrating new populations, and managing the complexities of governing the world's most diverse and populous state. The Manchus had achieved something that seemed impossible. They had become the guardians and perfecters of Chinese civilization while maintaining their own distinct identity and traditions, creating a hybrid culture that was stronger and more dynamic than either of its components alone. The Manchu conquest of China stands as perhaps history's most complete and successful example of cultural transformation, political adaptation, and strategic vision, overcoming seemingly impossible odds to create lasting change on a global scale. What began as a collection of feuding tribes scattered across the frozen wastelands of Manchuria became, within the span of a single century, the ruling dynasty of the world's most populous, sophisticated, and economically powerful empire. The key to their extraordinary success wasn't superior numbers, which they never possessed, or overwhelming military technology, which remained roughly equal between the forces involved, but rather their unprecedented willingness to learn, adapt, and synthesize the best elements of multiple cultures into something greater and more effective than the sum of its parts. The Manchus understood with remarkable clarity that true conquest wasn't about destroying what came before or imposing their own limited tribal traditions on a vastly more complex civilization, but about improving upon existing systems while respecting their essential character and adapting them to meet new challenges and opportunities. Their approach to governance represented a revolutionary advance in political thinking that influenced development across East Asia and created institutional innovations that would survive long after their dynasty fell. The Qing system of dual appointments, where Manchu and Chinese officials shared responsibility for every major government function, ensured both administrative competence and political stability while preventing the ethnic tensions that had destroyed previous foreign dynasties in China. Their military organization, based on the 8 banners system that incorporated soldiers from multiple ethnic backgrounds united by loyalty to the state rather than tribal affiliation, became a model for multi-ethnic armies that proved far more effective than traditional Chinese forces or conventional nomadic confederations. Most importantly, their cultural synthesis created a new form of Chinese identity that was more inclusive, dynamic, and adaptable than what had existed under previous native dynasties, while still maintaining the essential characteristics that made Chinese civilization distinctive and influential throughout the region. The territorial legacy of Manchu rule extends far beyond China's current borders and continues to shape the political geography of modern Asia in ways that most people don't fully appreciate. The Qing dynasty's expansion into Tibet, Xinjiang, Mongolia, and other frontier regions created the territorial boundaries that largely define modern China today, while their tributary relationships with Korea, Vietnam, and other neighboring states established patterns of regional influence that persist in modified forms. When European colonial powers began arriving in East Asia in significant numbers during the 18th and 19th centuries, they encountered not a declining Chinese empire, but a confident, prosperous, and territorially vast Qing state that had successfully integrated dozens of different ethnic groups and maintained effective control over a larger territory than any previous government in world history. The eventual decline of Qing power had less to do with internal Manchu failures than with the arrival of Western industrial technology, military innovations, and political ideologies that challenged all traditional Asian societies, regardless of their ethnic composition or governmental structure. The Manchu story offers profound lessons about leadership, cultural adaptation, and the complex dynamics of power that remain highly relevant in our increasingly interconnected and multicultural world. In an age when we often think of conquest and cultural contact in terms of domination, exploitation, and the destruction of local traditions, the Manchus provide a different model, one where victory came through synthesis, mutual adaptation, and genuine respect for the civilization they inherited and transformed. They demonstrated that the most profound and lasting changes often occur not when conquerors impose their will through force alone, but when they have the wisdom and flexibility to learn from those they govern while contributing their own innovations and perspectives to create something entirely new. Their success required abandoning the tribal exclusivity and cultural chauvinism that had defined their ancestors, embracing instead a more cosmopolitan vision that could incorporate talent and ideas from any source while maintaining the essential identity and values that had brought them to power. Perhaps most importantly, the Manchu experience proves that history's greatest transformations often come not from the expected sources of power and influence, but from those willing to think differently about what power means and how it should be exercised in practice. The great Chinese emperors who preceded them had relied primarily on the weight of tradition, the prestige of established institutions, and the assumption that their cultural superiority would automatically translate into political success. The Manchus, lacking such advantages, were forced to be more creative, more adaptive, and ultimately more effective in their approach to governance and cultural leadership. They succeeded because they understood that legitimacy must be earned rather than inherited, that effective rule requires constant attention to the needs and aspirations of all subjects regardless of their ethnic background, and that the greatest strength comes not from rigid adherence to past practices, but from the intelligent synthesis of the best ideas available from any source. The barbarians had indeed become emperors, but in doing so, they had also become something their ancestors could never have imagined: the guardians, perfecters, and ultimately the most successful exemplars of one of humanity's oldest, most sophisticated, and most influential civilizations. Their dynasty ruled China for 268 years, longer than most native Chinese dynasties, and far longer than any other foreign conquest dynasty in Chinese history. When the Qing finally fell in 1912, it wasn't due to ethnic tensions between Manchus and Chinese or failures in their system of cultural synthesis, but to the arrival of modern nationalism, industrial technology, and democratic ideologies that challenged all traditional monarchical systems, regardless of their ethnic composition or historical achievements. Even then, the Republican Revolution that overthrew them was led by Chinese, who had internalized many Manchu governmental innovations and territorial concepts, while the last emperor, Puyi, remained a Manchu, whose personal story became a symbol of the broader transformation of traditional Asian societies in the face of modern global forces. Their story continues to resonate powerfully today, offering insights about cultural adaptation, effective leadership, and the possibilities for positive transformation that remain relevant in our interconnected world, where different cultures, ethnicities, and traditions must find ways to coexist and collaborate effectively. The Manchu Conquest wasn't just a change of dynasty or a shift in political control. It was a masterclass in how seemingly impossible transformations become not only possible, but inevitable, when vision, strategy, cultural sensitivity, and adaptive capacity align at the right moment in history. In a world still struggling with questions of cultural identity, effective governance, and the integration of diverse populations into stable political systems, the Manchu example provides both inspiration and practical guidance for how such challenges might be successfully addressed through wisdom, patience, and the willingness to learn from both success and failure in the pursuit of lasting positive change.